Uh, I think this is the wrong version, Mum. Yeah. Now let me stop sharing my screen because I there's a way I need to share it, which includes computer sound, which I should have done. That Hello, everybody. In this presentation, I will apply trauma theory to these fairy tales, the young slave, as it has contemporary ideas about trauma, and I will examine how these aspects are lost in a later variant of the Grimm's Snow White. So, Penta the Handless sets up a theme of maiming women, but showing their resilience at the same time. It flips the status quo on its head by stripping these women of uh, their social class, but they stay resilient because they're helped by um, allies. The young slave is similarly named by having her hair uh, cut off and stripped of her social class, but she does not have um, allies. So my question is, what happens when a young princess is left to kind of dwell in trauma? Let's start with a summary of a young slave. Lisa is born from a rose petal and then dies and is locked in a glass casket. Her body develops, but her mind's still stuck as a child. Then her stepmother turns her into a slave. She gets a doll. She talks to the doll. She's rescued by her uncle. It all ends happily ever after. So, trauma. Let's start. Let's move on to what do we mean by trauma. Trauma, Caruth said, is more than a uh, illness. It's a story of a wound. And the way I mean trauma in this instance and the trauma narrative is it's about the difficulty of representing the truth of an experience so awful that it cannot be contained within the mind. And this invisible wound stops Lisa from gaining agency as she can't really process what has happened to her. One of the ways she tries to process and assign new meaning, as Harvey says, is through creative pursuit. And having a doll allows girls to kind of become young mothers as they care for it, and allows Lisa to practice forming new relationships, which allows her to recover. These relationships and the doll significantly don't happen in Snow White, which is why it's not a trauma narrative. The stepmother's abuse strips Lisa of her social class and removes gender expectations. Zipes says Basile takes delight in minimizing the difference between coarse peasants and high aristocrats. I'm going to take this one step further and say the reason why Basile enjoys doing this is so he can explore what happens when the high aristocrats don't have that same social status to rely on. The stepmother cuts off Lisa's hair, which is a symbol of her femininity and sex appeal, which is really significant as in this time marriages are kind of seen as a trans action, so she can't be married off. She cuts her hair off, essentially making her androgynous, and lumps and eggplants are associated with the kitchen, so the stepmother's not even letting her do that, turning the expectation of being a kitchen maid against her. But as we can see in the following slides, Lisa does retain some of those high aristocratic behaviors. Recovery. So, recovery can only take place within the context of relationships. It cannot occur in isolation, as the survivor kind of recreates these psychological facilities like autonomy and identity. She tries to create her, tries to kind of mend these things through talking to the doll, as she doesn't trust the kind of high aristocrats, as they kind of ignore her because she's a slave girl. So by talking to the doll, she's trying to regain that sense of trust and intimacy with people by telling her kind of her darkest secrets. But she kind of attempts to claim back control by telling that kind of bundle of rags, which is of course associated with low social class, by threatening to kill herself. Here we see her kind of acting like a high aristocrat. She's trying to claim back control by commanding a servant-like figure in the doll to listen to her. She's kind of seeing the doll as a almost like her own slave, and by using a emotional blackmail, by threatening to kill herself. She's proving she doesn't have those kind of psychological faculties, and and this is sadly her way of gaining that sense of agency. So, right, so is there a kind of happy ending? So the uncle puts her in the care of a relative of his, so she can recover a little. What's really significant is she's half of what she was. So unlike Snow White, who's kind of seen as this fully beautiful being who doesn't have trauma, Basile recognizes that it has really affected her and is sending her in for treatment. The other really interesting thing is the word goddess, which kind of suggests she's kind of earned a higher status by going through this trauma. Her kind of appearance and gender expectations have become elevated because there's kind of this beauty in suffering and being vulnerable, which is really interesting. Now, let's move on to Snow White and how most of this exploration of trauma is actually just lost. And what's changed? Is it because they're for children, or is there a darker purpose in the way that we view femininity, which kind of carries over to today? So let's look at a meal and an education. Opinion is the grave of virtue among men, and its throne among women. So the kind of male gaze and vanity is kind of seen as a prize for women as it isn't for men, and we can see this in the mirror on the wall. Who is the fairest of them all? They're the stepmothers looking to attain the prize of femininity. But what's interesting is, in the young slave, this idea is kind of challenged by showing the mental trauma and showing the effects of this. In Snow White, it's not as Snow White is kind of taught to be modest and reserved, and not taught to show evidence of her trauma. She's encouraged to show evidence of her virtue, and we can kind of see this in the huntsman, where she says, "Oh dear huntsman, let me live." Notice the word dear there, which suggests virtue, and kind of suggests she's looking up to him with a sense of respect. And because she was so beautiful, because she's seen as modest and attentive, this ultimately saved her life. Poor child, the huntsman is seeing her as this kind of innocent thing rather than a person with agency. So the huntsman kind of lets her go. A point of a scale. This is kind of where my argument that Snow White doesn't undergo trauma or doesn't undergo that recovery process can be challenged because of the dwarves to kind of be seen as a point of a escape or a paradise where she's kind of able to escape from the trauma around her, and but this isn't the case, as the dwarves don't actually pay attention to her trauma. They make her work instead, and because she's kind of modest and attentive and taught to kind of look for virtue, she's encouraged to kind of completely work and do what they want, instead of kind of speaking up for her own needs and processing her own trauma, which is the other point that can be challenged is she steals from them. So she's not being modest and attentive. She's actually committing wrong actions, but she's, which could be seen as almost a cry for help, but because she's so desperate, her femininity kind of becomes undone. But because the dwarves see her as modest and beautiful, they kind of let that go and see her as kind of a way to basically do housework. Then she dies. Both stories reflect today's attitudes about mental health in different ways. This is why a discussion like this is so important. Snow White reflects how we can mask our mental health and appear to be a certain way with others. How things like beauty and masculinity can act as a distraction, but it also shows how this mask can work, as Snow White does in fact marry the prince who only sees her as modest and attentive. The casket that comes from the young slave is a really important symbol of the male gaze, because it encourages the prince to be to watch her rather than interact with her. This encourages the prince to see her in a sexualized way rather than actually developing their relationship and exploring the trauma. In contrast, the young slave portrays the importance of getting help with the uncle and therapy, but perhaps more importantly, it portrays the breaking point and how trauma can be healed by safety and a feeling of control over the surroundings, and giving people the space to heal. And that's it. No, that's it.
It's been Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you for your wonderful paper, which, yes, is very thought-provoking, and it is, yes, it enhances our reflection, stimulates reflection on the concept of trauma in fairy tales and tales of magic. Thank you. I'm sure there will be lots of questions at the end of this panel. So, our next speaker is Assunta Vitale, Dr. Assunta Vitale.
Hello.
Hello, Assunta, welcome. Assunta received a PhD in Italian Studies from the University for Foreigners of Pisa in 2022. And on the same year, she published her first monograph, which is based on extensive research, doctoral extensive research, entitled La molteplicità, una categoria barocca per lo Cunto dei Conti. So multiplicity, a Baroque category for the Tale of Tales. Since 2018, Assunta has been very active in the academic world. She has collaborated with the International Center for 17th Century Studies at the University for Foreigners in Siena. And in the same year, she also became member of a research group on studying the Tuscan academies in the 17th century. And so these are her main field of research at the moment. So 17th century literature and Tuscan academies in the same period. So Assunta's paper is entitled The Narrative Frame of the Cunto, Structure, Collections, and Paradoxes. Over to you, Giulia. Assunta. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me fine? Okay.
Fine.
Perfect.
Perfect.
So I would like to thank all the conference organizers, especially Ada Robbins. And I will now share with you my presentation. Can you see it? Perfect. So, as you can see from the title of my paper this afternoon, will be focused on the narrative frame of Lo Cunto dei Punti. I will talk about three particular features: the nature and structure of the framework, focusing on some traits that are consistent even in the other 49 tales, some elements of this frame that can be attributed to a typical tendency of Baroque culture, precisely collecting, and finally on the paradoxical nature of this frame tale. Obviously, those elements are intimately connected, so there will be some overlaps. During my speech, I will show you some quotes from the Cunto, but for verity's sake, I won't be able to read them. In the slide, you see above the Neapolitan version of the text from the 2013 Carolina Stromboli edition. And below, there will be the 2007 English translation by Nancy Canepa. So, first of all, we have to consider that the Cunto's frame tale, even if it has marked similarities with the frame tales of other tale collection of the modern era, it has some peculiarities. If we think about, for example, the time and place of the introduzione, so it's called the frame tale, we can see that the story of Zoza, our heroine, is set in an indefinite time. It starts with it is said that there once was, and in places of pure invention, precisely Valle Pelosa and Campo Rotunno. If we look at reference model of the Cunto, Boccaccio's Decameron and Straparola's Piacevoli Notti, to mention the best known, they are instead set in a precise historical times and in real places. The former during the plague epidemic in the 1348 and in the Florentine countryside, and the latter around the 1536 on the island of Murano. Considering even these two aspects alone, we realize that the nature of the Cunto framework is typologically different from its reference models. Zozo's story is indeed like the other 49 tales told in the Cunto. It is a not realistic tale, but I will expand on this later. Looking at the narrative frame tale, we say that it is opened by a popular saying, highlighted in teal, and by a popular anecdote, the monkey tale, highlighted in yellow. That those two gave the readers the moral keys to interpret Zozo's story. If we look at the other 49 tales, here some example to be precise, we'll say that almost everyone are opened by popular saying recited by the woman who tells the tale. The only exception are Petrosinella in the second day, the three animal kings in the fourth day, and Sun, Moon, and Thalia in the fifth day. As with the frame, these expressions and proverbs that open almost all the tale offer readers a sort of moral compass, if you want, sometimes humorous, with which to read the tales. This moral is also repeated at the end of each tale with a closing proverb. This aspect is linked, I believe, to the exemplarity of all this tale and on the story in the book. Thus, also including the frame, which is essentially a tale exemplifying the peril of deception. Another key element of the frame is handed to us at the beginning of the fifth day. All the female, including Zoza, began to play with the steward Cola Jacopo, a game called the Game of Games, Lo Gioco delle Gioche. If we look carefully at this game, we can find that it mirrors all the book. Even its name reflects the title of the book, and especially it mirrors the fifth day. It began with Cola Jacopo explaining the rules in the slide highlighted in teal, and just like Taddeo has done at the beginning when he tells how the forward days will be going, but before explaining the rules, he says something that can easily summarize the purpose of the entire Cunto, just like Taddeo did during his preliminary speech. So this game is played under Taddeo's supervision. We see some example, just like the storytelling during the 5 days. We see him validate every response of the women to Cola Jacopo. On the slide, you can see the turn of Zezza, Cecca, Menega, and Tolla. So the first 8 women play the game, and each one wins. But something's happened when it's Ciomitella's turn, because Cola Jacopo thinks that she hasn't answered correctly to his question, and so he says that she has to pay a penalty. But Taddeo convinced him otherwise. This part somehow, I think, anticipates the end of the 5th day, because the tale that Ciomitella will tell that day will be too near the truth, too near slave deception, and therefore not exactly like the other tales of the day. Finally, it's Zoza's turn. But she loses at the Game of Games. just like she will lose at the game of tales, because she won't be able to tell an invented tale, just like the other female storytellers did. So just these elements, I think, highlight the perfect architecture of the frame tale and, of course, of the Cunto himself. I'll now turn on the second feature of the frame that I will analyze today. Baroque culture has some typical tendencies, and one of which is collecting. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, wealthy men began to set up collection of mirabilia to create what we call Wunderkammer. These chambers of curiosities were created primarily to arouse wonder in the people who visit them, but they also reflect a way of approaching knowledge and bringing order to a reality that they perceived as confused and disorganized. If we look at the Cunto in this perspective, we can see that this book is indeed a literary collection in which many elements of Basile's reality are incorporated, including words, expression, proverb, and so on. I will focus, of course, on the frame tale, but this kind of observation can be applied to the whole book, especially to the eglogies that end each day. So starting from the first day, we can observe a collection that is linked with the 17th century's taste for teratology. The female storytellers are all described by their deformities, creating a small collection of human physical defects. We see big-nosed Tolla, Launchback Popa, cross-eyed Paula, and so on. A little bit forward in the same day, we see other two small collections that we find in the Taddeo's preliminary discourse. First, a little collection of profession. We see artisans, merchants, lawyers, schoolkeepers, shopkeepers, and another collection of folk literature genres, highlighted in teal: pleasant tales, false news, invented broadsides, and airy gadgets. If we observe now the introduction to the second, third, fourth, and fifth day, we can see that they, taken together, appear as a collection of court and folk entertainment. Here, the second day, we find a collection of court and children's games. I will not read them, but because they are a lot. As for the third day, we look at a collection of court and folk dances. Again, a lot. In the fourth day, there is another collection of games highlighted in teal. Then we have a collection of musical instruments highlighted in yellow, and popular songs highlighted in purple. Now, going back on Game of Games, I will show you only the English version. We can find, we can trace other collections. One of card games, all highlighted in yellow: Trionfello, Break the Bank, Malcontent, Four Corners, 20 Figure, and so on. And another collection of types of people: thief, merchants, flatterers, court gossipers, schoolmasters, and so on. So we can find many collections in the frame story alone. And if we look at the entire book, we can find many other collections. At the beginning of my speech, I said that I will elaborate on the fact that Zosa's story is like the other 49 tales told in the book. It has all the features of the others: infinite time and space, and presence of supernatural elements. So it is indeed a cunto piacevole, a pleasant tale, a nova fausa, a false news, what we now call fairy tale. But reading Zosa's speech at the end of the fifth day in the Scompetura, at the end of the book, we are told otherwise. We see in Zosa's speech that she is not accustomed to fabricating invention and waving fables, but that she is constrained by nature and by accident to tell the truth. So she has to tell the truth, to say something true. So from Zosa's point of view, and of course, from all the other characters' point of view, her story might coincide with the truth. But we can see that her story is like all the others told during the 5 days. So by the end of the book, we realize that I call it a paradoxical nature of the frame story. It is true and false at the same time. True in the narrative of the Cunto, but false and unrealistic to the readers. This aspect can possibly be related to the literary tastes of the Oziosi Academy of Naples. During their gathering, in fact, they used to engage in philosophical literary exercises, the paradoxa, in which a paradoxical theme was discussed in dialogical form. Perhaps Basile, who had been one of the founding members of the Oziosi Academy, as Lorenza Gianfrancesco reminded us this morning, had this kind of literary exercise in mind when writing the Cunto. And he designed his book in such manner as to create a game with the reader. It is up to the reader to understand the paradoxical nature of the narrative frame and ultimately of the entire book. So Basile is indeed the other fairy godfather, and Lo Cunto dei Cunti can undoubtedly be defined as one of the earliest fairy tales collection of Western Europe. But I'm convinced, and all today's speakers has proved it, that we should read this book first and foremost as a fine work of Baroque literature. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Assunta, for your very interesting paper, which makes us think about the broader context of Naples at the time. I'm particularly interested in your reconstruction of wonder cabinets, cabinet wonders that were nevertheless very fashionable in Naples at the time.
Yeah.
If one can only think about Ferrante Imperato or Giambattista della Porta's collection in museums. Yes, absolutely. Two spaces that Basile frequented and two people that Basile knew very, very well. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so our last speaker is Giulia.
Hello.
Hello, Giulia.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you perfectly. Giulia Depoli, who is a PhD student in Italian Studies and Modern Philology at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. The aim of her research project is to examine the cultural and narrative models which contributed to the birth of the 15th century Italian vernacular novella, focusing on three main literary fields: Boccaccio and the late 14th century Tuscan novella, Christian hagiography, and Neo-Latin humanist short fiction. The title of Giulia's paper is Neapolitan Folktales Between the 15th and the 17th Centuries, Masuccio, Morlini and Basile. Over to you, Giulia.
Thank you very much. I wish to thank everyone for having me here today, and shall share my presentation. Can you all see it correctly? Okay. So the aim of my paper is to explore the forms of folk storytelling in Neapolitan literature during the early modern period, before Basile's collection of tales. I will try to shed light on the forms in which folktale elements were incorporated into short narratives, on the premises upon which Basile was able to create his Cunto. As I mentioned in the title, the writers I will consider in my inquiry are Masuccio Salernitano and Girolamo Morlini, who, between the late 15th century and the early 16th century, wrote two collections of short stories, choosing the same narrative format adopted by Basile a century later. When we think of the Italian novella, we primarily refer to the tradition of Boccaccio, an unavoidable model for the narrators of the following centuries. Having the Decameron as a reference point means considering a predominantly realistic tradition. Nevertheless, folktale was not foreign to Boccaccio's own cultural horizon. In a famous passage from his treatise, Genealogia Deorum Gentilium, while discussing the veiled meanings of fictional narratives, he outlines what the critic Mario Lavagetto described as a snapshot of oral storytelling, entailing specifically ogres, fairies, witches, or similar beings. So even if these contents are not given any space in the Decameron, we can be certain that in the 14th century, that is arguably at the end of the Middle Ages, folktales were surely alive and well. However, in this study, we are dealing with authors who lived and wrote more than a century later. Masuccio Salernitano and Girolamo Morlini fully experienced the changed cultural landscape of Renaissance humanism. Therefore, it is worth dwelling on more textual evidence and investigating whether this framing is still applicable to this historical period. Even among the humanists, known to be refined scholars and imitators of the classics, there was no lack of familiarity with the folktale. Angelo Poliziano provides us with a remarkable insight on the matter, since he chose precisely a folktale character to prompt his opening oration to his university philosophy course on Aristotle's Analytica Priora. To address the link between folktale narratives and the teaching of ancient philosophy would take us off topic here. For those interested, I would certainly refer to Christopher Celenza's study on this specific oration. What matters most here is that the opening passage of Poliziano's treatise offers a vivid first-person account of fairy tale narration. The humanist recalls a recurring experience in his childhood, his grandmother telling him stories about lamias, witches who sucked blood, or even devoured children. Shifting our focus to the Kingdom of Naples, the area that interests us the most in this context, Giovanni Pontano, too, in his treatise De Sermone, mentions the folk tales that grandmothers would tell their children to make them fall asleep. These intellectuals bear witness of the ongoing popularity of folk tales in the cultural circles and the historical period I intend to deal with. However, a caveat must be made. All these accounts relate to a strictly oral tradition, which is markedly different from the literary collections I intend to analyze. Moreover, all the texts I have shown you highlight an inextricable link between this type of narration and female narrators, particularly older women. And ever since Cicero, the Aniles Fabelle, that is to say, old wives' tales, had had the reputation of being silly and unfounded tales, handed down from person to person thanks to collective and particularly womanly credulity, in stark contrast to the status of individual authorship and high literary value attributed to the Italian novella written by male authors from Boccaccio onwards. Additionally, this representation also implies a downgrading of the audience, limited to children or even infants. Instead, I want to focus precisely on literature, and specifically on the tradition of the Italian novella, to assess what kind of influence this folktale background had within the works of professional writers before Basile drew openly from it. I am certainly not the first to look for folktale traces in the Italian literary genre of the novella. Scholars who previously dealt with this topic, such as in recent years Laura Diafani, Fabrizio Scrivano, and Deborah Vitali, have indicated several elements of compatibility between the two kinds of narration, which allow for mutual exchanges. Both are short narrative forms, which often deal with common themes and motifs, such as the adventure of a hero, difficult tasks, perilous journeys through forests, recognition of the hero, the final achievement of a marriage, and so on and so forth. Moreover, even though the novella is a literary product, it pivots on an insistent fiction of orality. The fictional framework of these collections of stories always depicts, as we have seen already, one or more narrators in the act of storytelling to an audience of listeners. And as Professor Gianfrancesco mentioned before, the novellas could be performed as well. Therefore, the novella adopts many devices of oral storytelling, which liken it to the folktale. Finally, scholars have pointed to the versatility of the novella, a protean literary genre with no strict codification, therefore prone to experimentation and intermingling with other textual types. In addition to these inherent factors of compatibility, I argue that between the 15th and 16th century, the openness of the novella to contamination with folktale was favored by a cultural shift. Alongside the blooming of Renaissance courts and their refined customs, this historical period is also known for the emergence of disciplines like modern demonology and the new role of the Inquisition. Boccaccio's imitators in the early modern age wrote their stories in a changed intellectual context in which the supernatural entered the previously skeptical educated discourse. No longer limited to popular oral tales, witches, magic, and otherworldly beings emerged as increasingly frequent themes in high literature as well. Therefore, the genre of the novella gradually became permeable to folktale elements too. Nonetheless, the novella still strived to adhere to the model of Boccaccio and remained a predominantly realistic genre. This is just the first of several factors that, conversely, make this genre incompatible with the folktale. Generally speaking, the setting of the stories is historically and geographically defined. The characters are portrayed with a very similar individual psychology, although we have already discussed that this can be true for folktale too. Last but not least, the novella is usually a significantly more elaborated literary product, differing from the more essential and schematic folktale narration. These formal and thematic characteristics of the novella, as well as the different socio-cultural profile of its writers and readers, meant that folktale materials were not integrally and openly included in the novella from the get-go. This view is consistent with the so-called conduit theory. Here by conduit we mean individuals united by similar mindsets, people who react similarly to similar messages within given systems of communication. According to the encyclopedic entry written by Linda Dech, if a message, such as a folklore text, travels through its proper conduit, it goes unchanged from one person to another. However, if the message on its course reaches an inappropriate individual, it will either reach a dead end or survive by undergoing modifications. Within this context, I will argue that the folktale initially entered the new conduit of the novella through compromise formations, as if in disguise. To show you an example of this process, I will discuss the case of a novella by Masuccio Salernitano, which brings us to the city of Naples in the late Quattrocento. I will briefly introduce this author, as I am well aware that many people might not be familiar with him. Masuccio was born at the beginning of the 15th century in a noble family. He worked as a chancellor to the princes of Salerno and had important links with the Aragonese court. Between the 1450s and the 1470s, Masuccio composed a collection of 50 novellas called Il Novellino, which will soon be also available in an English translation by Michael Papio. Today, I am going to talk to you about his 26th novella. In this story, a young woman from Naples finds herself smitten with a boy she glimpses while passing in the street. Despite the intensity of her passion, she knows lovers to be loose-lipped. So she exercises self-restraint and devises a clever plan to enjoy his company while safeguarding her reputation. The young man agrees to meet her in a dark room, and in order to become her lover, he must swear to keep their relationship utterly secret. The protagonist consents, but immediately breaks his promise by telling all about this mysterious girl to his closest friend. Unfortunately, this confidant happens to be a courtier who wastes no time in recounting the incident at the palace, pretending it occurred in a distant land. Unbeknownst to the friend, one of the listeners happens to be a relative of the woman, who promptly informs her of her lover's breach of secrecy. Disappointed yet resolute, the woman concludes that the affair is not worth the trouble. With no desire to become the subject of Neapolitan gossip, she decides it is wiser to avoid any further encounters with the young man and seek a more discreet lover for herself. What may appear at first glance as a spicy tale set against the backdrop of contemporary Naples, amidst courtly gossip and rumors, is, in my opinion, an extremely original adaptation of a type of folktale which Laurent Saff-Lankner named the Melusinian plot. Here, I will take as a reference point for this The Lait du Lamval by Marie de France, since it was the most famous literary version of this narrative structure during Masuccio's time. In these narratives, a supernatural female character, often a fairy, falls in love with a mortal young man. The woman is unable to reveal herself directly and uses an intermediary to lead the beloved to her and enjoy his love. The central core of the plot revolves around an interdiction imposed on the man. If he respects this condition, he will receive love and fortune. However, the prohibition is unfailingly broken, and the man loses the favor of the woman. In the ending, the fairy may forgive the man, as in the case of Lamval, or she may abandon him to his fate for not keeping his promise. The crucial point of the Melusinian plot concerns the prohibition connected to the relationship that arises from a fundamental taboo which animates various fairy tales. The supernatural world cannot mix with the human one. It is precisely for this reason that I find Masuccio's operation extremely interesting, as he includes the fairy tale plot into his collection of novellas only on the condition of immersing it in complete realism, thereby nullifying the supernatural element. Unlike Lambal's mysterious lady, the woman has no magical powers. What makes her extraordinary is her prudence. And it should be specified that Masuccio's collection is fueled by a strongly misogynistic vein. So for the author, a wise woman is something bordering on the supernatural. However, in the absence of the taboo related to the folktale supernatural, Masuccio must find a new motivation for the interdiction to keep it in his plot. His solution is based on the ideal of the so-called perfect friendship, a very popular theme in Renaissance humanism. There is no one who does not have a perfect friend, that is, a best friend, to whom they can tell everything. This friend, in turn, will have another best friend, to whom they can tell everything, respectively, and so on. Therefore, the woman wants to keep her affair hidden to protect herself from this chain of open-hearted confessions between friend and friend, which inevitably degenerates into collective gossip. Thus, Masuccio's novella maintains a fairy tale structure, but not the original magical event. I would also like to draw attention to the second type of interdiction present in the novella, which we do not find in the Lamval-like narrations. Not only it is forbidden to speak to anyone about the relationship, but the magical lover cannot even be seen. The protagonist encounters the young Neapolitan woman in a completely dark room, where he has been led while blindfolded. This motif has its most famous embodiment in the story of Cupid and Psyche. The underlying principle is always the censorship of the supernatural element, even to the human lovers themselves. It is precisely this element that brings Masuccio's novella closer to the rendition of this plot by Basile, specifically the ninth tale of the second day, entitled Lo Catenaccio. In Basile's tale, the genders are reversed and match the Cupid-Psyche dynamic. Luciella, a very poor girl, while going to fetch water from a fountain, is stopped by a slave who invites her to follow him through a cave to a beautiful palace. Here, Luciella receives lavish banquets and beautiful clothes. At night, a mysterious young man hidden in darkness lies down in bed with her, only to vanish as soon as day breaks. When Luciella wishes to return home, she is forbidden to speak about the palace and the origin of her newfound wealth. One night, prompted by her jealous sisters, Luciella decides to break the prohibition and stay awake to light up the room and finally see her lover's face. She discovers that he is a handsome young man, but is subsequently stripped of her riches and expelled from the palace for her disobedience. In the last sequence of the story, it is revealed that the man is actually a prince, forced to live in hiding and wandering due to a curse. Once the spell is broken, the handsome prince and Luciella... Oh, God. Can you all hear me still?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Sorry, my connection is a bit faltery. So once the spell is broken, I was saying the handsome prince and Luciella can live happily ever after together. Both Masuccio's novella and Basile's Cunto are two different, yet closely related realizations of the Melusinian plot. The tales of these two authors testify to the persistence of this type of folktale in Naples between the 15th and the 17th centuries. However, the first one resorts to a realistic camouflage, still far from fully embracing the folktale in a written literary form. In the time span between Masuccio and Basile, another, perhaps lesser-known Neapolitan author took a further step towards the fairy tale without feeling the need to erase the magical and folkloristic elements. Not much is known about the life of Girolamo Morlini either. Born in the last quarter of the 15th century, presumed to have died after 1528, he was a law professor at the Studium, that is the University of Naples. He wrote a peculiar collection of 81 novellas and 20 Aesopic fables in Latin, which was published in 1520. In Morlini's novelle, genuine fairy tale elements coexist with realistic concealments. We still find instances in which the supernatural turns out to be fake and is subject to skepticism. This is the case with the novelle di beffa, that is to say prank tales, in which, according to a well-established tradition, only the gullible can truly believe in magic and otherworldly creatures. Let us consider the 28th novella. Every night, a woman cheats on her husband with a lover, right in their own bridal bed. One night, the husband notices the presence of the other man, but the woman makes him believe that it is a ghost haunting the house. Critics have pointed out a similar story in the collection by Anton Francesco Grazzini, another 16th century author, but a close, albeit less racy, precedent might be already found in the first novella of the seventh day of Boccaccio's Decameron. However, Morlini proves to be truly innovative in including cases of authentic fairy tale magic among the novellas, foreshadowing the developments later reached by Basile. Often, however, the fairy tale is cast in a grotesque and desecrating narrative. An example of this is the treatment of the recurring motif of talking animals helping the hero. In the 60th novella, birds reveal the presence of a hidden treasure to a man, but the communication is made possible only thanks to a magical herb that the man is accidentally using to clean himself. On the other hand, the magic in the 25th novella is all but laughable. A young man hears a voice coming from a tomb and goes to the rescue of a blind man who had fallen into it. Then he heads towards the house of the girl he loves, but stops on the way to help a hanged man who asks for assistance. It turns out to be a demon who, due to the hero's good deeds, spares his soul and even becomes his helper as he uses his powers to kill the girl's relatives, who were waiting for the young men in an ambush. In this uncanny folktale, Morlini unironically incorporates typical folktale motifs such as the unquiet grave, demonic possessions, and most notably supernatural help as a reward for acts of kindness of the hero. Gianni Villani referred to the generic section Friendly Return of the Dead in Rotunda's Motif Index. But as you can see, it is possible to link this tale to a much more relevant entry in Thompson's. Hanged Man warns youth against visiting sweetheart, takes youth's place, and receives shot meant for him. It is no coincidence that Morlini himself was a model of primary importance for Straparola, who a few decades later included some actual rewritings of these Latin novellas in his Piacevoli Notti, Pleasant Nights. The fact that even the northern Italian Straparola was influenced by a Neapolitan author shows us Renaissance Naples as a sort of propulsive center of literary folktales, leaving an indelible mark in the history of this narrative genre. Thank you.
Thank you, Giulia, for your splendid paper, which makes me think about the various courts in Naples. And I was wondering whether there are some elements that link the Neapolitan, the humanist and Renaissance Neapolitan tradition, or the tradition, the authors that you have analyzed in your paper, to Sannazzaro's Gli Ommeri.
Yes, I do think so. I'm not extremely familiar with the Yommeri, but yes, they were closely related. It's that cultural circle, I would say.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's open our discussion before we conclude this beautiful event. So are there any questions for our speakers? Oh, yes, Professor Ruthbeinheimer. Sorry for my horrible pronunciation. Sorry. So you are muted.
We still can't hear you, Sue, sorry. Why isn't it working? What's going on? Okay, I don't know how to fix. Sorry. Sue, can you use the chat? Sorry, because I can't figure out how to unmute you from here. But yeah, there's no other questions at the moment, so. Did anyone have a Teams bingo card? Because we've ticked off a lot of technical issues. We might have had full house. Can you see that in the chat, Lorenza? From Gary? No, Lorenza, you're on mute now.
If that's okay, I can answer to Gary Bliss.
Yeah, great.
Yes. So, for example, both Masuccio's Novellino and Morlini's Novelle were put into the index of prohibited books by the Pope in the middle of the 16th century. So the church was not enthusiastic, I would say.
And got a methodological question for Assunta. Assunta, can you see that in the chat? From from Sue. In folk narrative discourse, the presence of folktale motifs is often mentioned, but without dating their occurrence. Can you address this issue in conjunction with your own discussion?
I'm sorry. I couldn't. So, I'm sorry, I read again. In my perspective of studies, I don't refer much to folktale motif.
Okay.
Because
I was wondering if perhaps the question was for what was related maybe to my paper. I'm not sure, because I did mention them, so it might be for me. Okay.
Oh, sorry, Assunta,
Okay,
sorry.
that's
no,
that's
but no, it's for clarification. So I'm sorry, I can't hear that.
we
Sue, I
cannot
can
read.
see. No,
We
I
did
don't know why
not
it's
read
blurred
that.
out. Can you unmute me? I
Can
can't
you
unmute
mute?
you.
Okay.
I don't know how to unmute you.
So,
I can mute people, but I can't unmute them. I don't know why they've decided to do it that way.
I'm so sorry about not being able to talk to you, like to hear your voice directly, Professor Botti-Gachner, but I will try to reply. It is very difficult, at least it's been a very difficult issue to tackle for me, as in my studies, especially here in Italy, there is not much talk about folktale motifs. Like, these categories are not extremely used. So I do not have reference studies for these, except maybe some papers I happen to stumble across myself. I am not sure about how we can date these occurrences, but like the first occurrence of a folktale motif. However, recently I heard another professor talking about the persistence of these motifs, even across centuries, thanks to that conduit theory. That is, if a motif keeps being handed down from person to person, and these people create a somewhat uniform, coherent conduit, group of people that have similar mindsets and similar aims in their mind, it would appear that it can be passed on with no significant mutations, and so I am wondering if it would be an issue if, oh, I can hear you now, maybe.
Yes.
That's great.
Okay.
I don't know if I replied to your question.
You did, Assunta, but here's the problem with the conduit theory, and also with people treat the motif index as in an ahistorical manner. And the fact of the matter is that most of the motifs in the motif index that everyone uses were only documented in the 19th century, and that the fact that a motif exists 2,000 years ago doesn't mean that it is a folktale motif. It might mean that it's a motif that, through chapbooks, through the publication of stories in popular print, cheap print, that became known in the 19th century and 20th century, and thus entered folk narrative in the 19th century. But it cannot correspondingly be said that because a motif, I mean, if for instance, 2000 years ago, a shoe was dropped in a pharaoh's lap by a bird, that does not make that doesn't prove that the Cinderella story with a small shoe existed 2000 years ago. Only that story 2000 years ago had a small shoe, and that Grimm's tale 2000 years later had a small shoe. So that's a problematic methodological point. And I invite you to be very careful about using the presence of a what is now called a folk motif that's based on 19th century recording as proof that a 16th or 17th century story drew on folk narrative, oral narrative, when it might be the other way around.
Oh, absolutely. That's a brilliant point, and I actually agree. I will be very careful in the future. What I just wanted to highlight is that indeed what Morlini wrote then became perceived at a certain point in time as a folktale, so it is compatible with at least what we at least now think of as folktale. But I oh my God.
Well, just think about it when you encounter it in your work.
I'm sorry, my connection went off, so I couldn't hear you. But I just wanted to thank you very much for your advice.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Assunta.
If I may, what Giulia was saying, that from that time it began fairy tales. It is, I think, true, extremely true, because if we, for example, we read how Basile's define his stories, he said Cunto piacevole, or false news, or some other definition. We now call them fairy tales, but then they haven't a name, or not in the literature.
Lorenzo, you put your hand up, but I think you're sharing.
Yes, yes, just comments on Assunta's remark. Assunta, Basile uses words such as false news, falsi avvisi, or gazzette. Do you think this is?
I think the precise is Cunto piacevole, because if we read, for example, Cortese Viaggi di Parnaso, we see that he calls what we now call fairy tales, he calls them bello Cunto.
Absolutely.
It is Cunto, in Neapolitan it is Cunto, Cunte, or Cunti. There are some variables, but the adjective piacevole or bello added to Cunto give them the unrealistic features, I think. In my research, I find that those adjectives remark not the novella type of story.
Absolutely, absolutely. I was just referring to something else you were saying, and which appeared in one of your slides, the reference to falsi avvisi and gazzette. So, and I thought you were making a connection between Cunti and this phrase, which nonetheless opens up a completely different debate on the Neapolitan public sphere and the dissemination of news, which Basile refers to prominently throughout Lo Cunto. So that was my comment.
No, they also used by him to somehow describe the tales that
speculated
will be told
in the city. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think that, for example, the false broadcasts of avvisi inventati, they are, for example, of inspiration for the Ragguagli di Parnaso of Boccalinis. So it is a popular kind of
literary genre, although quite different from
from the fairy tale,
from the tale of magic. Yes, absolutely. Yes, and there were quite a few Journey to Parnassus, apart from Cortese, written in Naples at the time within academies again. Orazio Gomites, Viaggio in Parnaso is one example. Absolutely. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Professor Botting. Thank you.
Is the mic on? Can you hear me? Okay. This is an observation I made in conjunction with Ben Geyer's presentation, and it is this: in his discussion, in your discussion, Ben, of trauma in Basile and Grimm. I found that very interesting, particularly when you got to Grimm. Now, what the reason is that the Grimm's tales, when they were published in the 19th century, were not, in fact, well received commercially. The fairy tale collection that was known and much more successful in terms of publication and sales was by a contemporary named Ludwig Bechstein. And what's very interesting in conjunction with your discussion of trauma is that Bechstein's tales are characterized by the agency conferred on boys and girls. And there is less trauma in Bechstein's collection as a whole, and many of the same tales appear in the Grimm and the Bechstein collections. So I was trying to check during your talk on Bechstein's version of Snow White, which he has as Schneeweißchen instead of Grimm's Schneewittchen, and I wasn't able to read that particular tale as closely as I would like, but I recall another tale called The Glass Mountain, in which a girl wants to save her brothers, and she's at the bottom of the glass mountain and needs to get to the top. And she thinks to herself, imagine that, a girl thinking to herself in the mid-19th century, if I had wings, I could fly to the top of the glass mountain. Then she sees some geese. So she takes action, catches a goose, takes its wings, and flies to the top of the mountain. And this is a perfect example of the kind of agency you never find in Grimm's tales. And I would venture to guess that if there were a tale that the Grimms had come upon in the early part of the century, in which a child, or for that matter, a woman who was not a queen or the Virgin Mary, if that kind of character had agency, they would have edited it out by the final edition in 1857. So I wanted to mention that to you because you may find in your work on trauma that checking another collection of tales that actually was more gained more popular support in the 19th century than the Grimms might be an interesting source to pursue.
That's a really fascinating point, because I didn't know about the other German collection of fairy tales. I do think though there's an interesting point, and I would have brought this up in my presentation if I had more time. That there's a different there's a kind of male response to trauma in the juniper tree, where the child that has to transform into a bird and kill the kind of parental figures, and there's a kind of really interesting debate there over whether that counts as overcoming trauma or gaining
I would say that it does.
As he has to transform in order to be able to get stuff done.
That tale gives a very good example of a stepmother who is devilishly manipulative in psychological terms in getting the girl, isn't it, to think she kills the boy.
Yeah.
Then she arranges things so that it appears to the girl that the girl herself has done the act that results in his death. And it's a very interesting tale and fits very closely with what you're dealing with. So carry on. I think you're onto a good thing.
Yes, thank you. I really admire your work as well. I read some and during my undergrad degree.
Thank you.
And Tommaso would like to ask a question.
Yes, just a little question. Is about the paradox of the fiction and the truth. I will say how much reality is in the fiction of Basile, of the Cunti. If we start with what the Johnny Getto said about that the Basile fairy tales is nourished by the real. Where we can stop the real and where is the fiction? Because most of the tales, they are a reality of Neapolitan reality or the Neapolitan area. If we can just thinking about il cibo, nourishment. I don't want to say about that we heard so many times about l'addio nella fiaba del mercante, when he's going away from Naples on Saturday. So all the plates, nourishment is real. It's not fiction. Just if somebody can just give me something about that, the reality and the fiction. My opinion is that the reality is permea, I don't know in English that word, is present everywhere in the country.
Yeah, if I may.
Of course.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm completely agree with you. Yeah, but I think that Basile's Cunto is a reality under the fairy tale mask, but it is about reality. We see a lot of like to comes to mind the eglogas that close every day. They are reality. They are absolutely against every thought of reality in Basile's perspective. So it is it's difficult to understand when the one finish and the other begin. But what I refer to the paradoxes or paradoxical nature of the frame is just it's a conceptually paradox. Only that, because we are told by Zoda that she has to tell the truth, but in reality, if we see only the structure of her story, it is like all the other. And because Taddeo calls them false news, we have this later conflict between false and true.
Yeah.
So that's the paradox. The paradox I mean, but I agree. Basile's reality is present everywhere.
Yeah, I agree with you when you said that he masked something, but it's like what he said. He said everything is going with the mask today. So maybe, I'm just thinking like that he is put on a mask to unmask something, to unveil something. And maybe we can play on that two words, to mask, to unmask. I don't know.
Well, I think that he put attenta on everything, like he said in the egloga.
Yeah,
absolutely. That is a great point, and the two dimensions are intertwined, and sometimes reality is reworked through the lens of erudite debates are reworked through the lens of reality. And if we consider the frame tale, at the beginning, when Zoza sees the old woman who is trying to to collect as much oil as possible, and she laughs after after a long period of sadness and depression. We can see probably the representation of public festivities, so the cuccagna, and the fact that these scenes were there just to amuse the elite. And Basile was part of that entourage, not as a member of the elite, but as a courtier, as one who supersedes festivities, organized these events, and therefore the piazza, what is outside the palace, corresponds to what was happening in Naples, reworks through a comical and very sophisticated, context that is the fairy tale, the tale of magic. Absolutely, I agree with both of you. So, are there any other questions or comments?
There was one from Gary in the chat.
Oh,
I don't know. It's about it says, was there regional/language folktale rivalries across Italy at this time?
What were the regional language folktale rivalries across Italy at this time? Well, does anybody want to say a few words about the language question in Italy at the time? Well, the language question was at the center of a hot debate that, tried to promote local languages, vernaculars, and local heritage, local culture. And so there was competition. Within a southern Italian context throughout the Kingdom of Naples, there was not so much competition, but collaboration on this within this debate. So we see similar type of debates happening in Sicily, in Sicilian academies, in academies based in Apulia, as well as in Naples. So within the Kingdom of Naples, this was a central debate of the that revolved around the language question and the promotion of a local heritage that was expressed and manifested in folktale literature. Absolutely. Julia, can you hear us?
Yes, yes, I do.
Yes, yes, yes. In relation to the language question and this important question, do we have anything similar in I don't know, Tuscany, for example?
In Tuscany, you mean in the tradition of these centuries? Yes. So in the period I'm studying is the 15th century mainly. So in the 15th century, we have we have some fights about language also in Tuscany. For example, there is this author we know as Sermini, who was not actually called Sermini, but it's the name, the pseudonym we have, who wrote in the dialect of Siena, whereas maybe the more popular not folk tales, but I would say novellas were written in the Florentine dialect. So there was a very, we say campanilismo. There was a fight between, some rivalry between towns for certain. I would also like to add that Masuccio, when he wrote his novellino that is in Neapolitan, I showed you translations of mine. I did not show you the original language. Unfortunately, we do not have the original because it was burned. So we don't have the Neapolitan original, but we have some versions that were printed in the north of Italy, the 16th century, basically, that still shows some bits of his Neapolitan, but the author himself starts by saying, I apologize for the low quality of my mother tongue. So it was felt like a defect for some extent, a flaw, yeah.
Of Neapolitan?
The Neapolitan, yes.
Yes. Oh, yes. It became a regional type in Neapolitan, especially in theatre in the 16th century. As much
Absolutely.
as other regional types were stereotypically represented in theatre, with who were speaking their own local language, which was teased according to the author and the geography of the work produced. So it's very interesting to see that competition occurring throughout the peninsula. And Assunta, Assunta, in the 17th century, this question of the language competition.
I get that if
in Tuscany.
In Tuscany, here we have the Crusca. So we have all the linguistic question. So to which language we have to include in the vocabulary. So there's a lot of discussion about that, but not about the type of language. On the author that can be used as example of language. I think that the only rivalities, if we will call that, I don't think it's really a rivalities or a conflict. It may be between Florentine language and all the other language of Italy, because dialects are in Italy are language. So that's the only conflict I may think about. But Other than that, there's the question of the authors that can be included or not in the vocabolario della Crusca.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
There's in the chat again. So there's one from Kate who says, do Disney movies still perpetuate negative female stereotypes in fairy tales with regards to both the female protagonist and also the antagonist? I feel like Disney is trying quite hard to crack down on it, but they've just released a Little Mermaid and she still loses her voice for a boy.
Is this for me to do with the trauma
Kate?
stuff?
Oh no, it's just in general, but your talk really explained a lot of it, so yeah.
I think Tangle is quite interesting. Because of the mother Gothel actively causes trauma by lighting and actively showing the effects of it, because that's a tale that's because the way Mother Gothel controls Rapunzel is through shame and making her feel bad about it, which isn't necessarily seen in any other Disney films as far as I know. That would be my point there. So we may have the Little Mermaid, but we also have that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ben. It was yes, very thought-provoking answer. Yes. Another example that comes to my mind in relation to Kate's question is the traditional representation of Cinderella, Disney's Cinderella, as at least a few decades ago. Yes, as a pacified, beautified female character, which is the opposite of Basile's Cinderella. Absolutely, who kills her stepmother, who undergoes a transformation which is very personal. She just defeats all the enemies and yes, triumphs in the end. But one thing she's not is a passive female individual.
Yeah, I tend to notice that the Disney is producing more proactive women with agency, and sort of passive princesses like Snow White and Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty are sort of a thing of the past. You know, and we've got Beauty and the Beast and the Little Mermaid and the princess from Aladdin. They tend to be a lot more possess a lot more agency compared to the princesses, you know, in previous stories.
Absolutely, absolutely. Do we have any other questions or comments? No? Okay, anything in the chat? No. So we can then bring this wonderful and very successful event to an end. We would like to thank all of you, all speakers,